Well, it's been a quiet start to the morning in Marshalltown, but there is a heavy police presence in the vicinity of a devastating fire that claimed the lives of 74 people in the early hours of yesterday. At least 10 of the people who were burnt beyond recognition have yet to be identified. By last night, the Provincial Health Department had revealed that 40 of the deceased are men and 24 women. Of those, 12 are children. More than 200 families have been displaced and a temporary shelter has now been set up at least until the weekend. Let's take you live to Marshalltown, where we find my co-anchor Ayanda Nyathi, who yesterday, Ayanda, tracked the story from the onset, from when we first got the news in the early hours of the morning. You were there since 6 o'clock, and that story continued to develop and the devastation just continued to grow.
Yeah, few people, Michelle, would have been able to guess that the story would evolve into what it's become, attracting the attention of the #1 citizen in this country, Cyril Ramaphosa, cancelling a previous arrangement when he was meant to address the nation yesterday on a completely different matter, and deciding to see firsthand what has happened here. There's a groaning stillness, that's the only way I can describe it now, in the aftermath of what unfolded yesterday. But the police presence that's also here is not easy to miss. And that's partly because it's so uncharacteristic to have so many people at the center of the CBD in Johannesburg, which is known mostly to be the most unsafe place, or one of the most unsafe places to be in the province. I'm going to step out of shot very quickly, get you a sense of what the mood is like, especially of the building itself. And there it is. You know, we are able to get much closer to it now than we could yesterday, and I suppose that's because the bulk of the business done by law enforcement is essentially over. EMS telling us yesterday that after conducting their own probe, sweeping through the building itself, they'll be able to finally hand it over to forensics and police for them to conduct their own investigations. I am tempted to say that life has returned to normal here, but that's probably a bit of a stretch given just how devastating the story has been. But the roads are open once again. People are walking about, I presume, to and from work. There's a taxi also going through the shot. And so it almost feels like in the next 24 hours, you'd be forgiven if you missed that 74 people may have died here. Nonetheless, we're going to hopefully take stock for you what happens next as we try also piece together the important questions to be asked moving forward. And of course, we've been covering the story from a number of vantage points. Zikhona, Tshona, part of our team who was here late into the evening yesterday, she's with us live once again at the corner of Albert and Delver Street. And devastating what obviously took place here, Zikhona. You were here when President Cyril Ramaphosa also arrived last night. Perhaps let's begin there. How would you describe the way in which he was received?
Well, when he arrived, it was pretty late and relatively dark. He didn't get much time to interact, particularly with the victims or survivors from this building. He got cheers from onlookers who were on the crowd, particularly from the neighboring buildings or residential areas. It was very brief. As you've mentioned, he did say this was unprecedented, very shocking, and he said it was a wake-up call to government to deal with the issue of human settlement, to deal with the issue of housing, particularly in the city of Johannesburg. We know a lot of people come to Johannesburg looking for opportunities, looking for jobs. So many of them are going to want to live around the CBD so that they can be very close to those opportunities. But let's take a listen to what the president had to say when he came here late yesterday.
We've got to go to the bottom of what caused this fire and also address from now on. It's a wake-up call for us to begin to address the situation of housing in the inner city. That a building like this, which I'm told used to be a home for abused women and children, once the lease had expired, it was then hijacked, and we need to get on top of this and find effective ways of dealing with problems of accommodation, of housing and services in the inner city.
Of course, Zikhona, local government authorities were also here yesterday in their numbers, all the way from the ward councillor of this particular region right up to the mayor. What did some of them have to say?
Well, as you would have seen, particularly at the start of the day, just watching those numbers, rise was unbelievable, that death toll. We started off at 10, then it was 14, and before 1 o'clock it was at 73. So it's not unexpected that government leaders would want to come here, and we now know that this building that does belong to the city of Johannesburg. We know that it used to be a shelter for GBV victims, and many people who live around this building say at the point at which it stopped being a shelter, it should have really been demolished because they saw it deteriorate. We heard Robert Mulaudzi from EMS saying that inside here was basically an informal settlement because people had built their own structures within the structure. Yesterday we also managed to speak to a woman who actually came to seek refuge in this shelter before 2018 when it stopped becoming a shelter. And she says when she saw people moving in, particularly men, the number of men that were coming into the building, it started becoming unsafe. And a lot of people here say actually it's not safe to walk around this building at all. So a lot of government officials, particularly from the city of Johannesburg, did come out here. We know that the building was hijacked in around 2018. So there again starts the conversation around the hijacking of buildings in and around the city. So the city now saying they need to deal with that urgently. But let's take a listen at what Colleen Makubele had to say, who's the speaker of the city of Joburg.
It still leaves a bitter taste because we still have not established what is the cause of the fire and where are the perpetrators, where are the hijackers of this building. That's what we want to know, and what is happening with those hijackers. But also what I also want to appeal, especially to the foreign nationals that have been injured, that have loved ones as well that are deceased, please, they must not be afraid to come out and talk to us. We are at a stage of a crisis. We want to assist all of them. Let them go to hospital to be treated. We're not going to be looking at documentation today. We know most of them are hiding out. They don't want to go to hospitals, and they need attention. This is a humanities crisis.
Now, of course, Zikhona, the scene here is very different to what it was yesterday. I mean, there was just, you could barely move. The president himself could barely get to some of the officials to brief him. How would you sort of contrast how it was looking like yesterday to what we're met with this morning?
So this morning we're able to get much closer to the building, but you can see the surrounds of the buildings have the security around it is much tighter, because we did actually see late yesterday people who say their spaces have not been affected by the fire trying to get into the building, but of course it's still not safe to do so. This building is still a crime scene, and we are expecting more officials to continue to come to this building to come and assess and further assess, particularly with regards to the fact we don't know yet the cause of this fire, but also a lot of people were living here.
Yeah.
People were sharing a small space here, 10 people at a time. But the majority of them, many of them, women and children. So it's certainly not safe to come here. But we can see the roads have opened up. But I still see the private security that was brought in by the city still keeping a close eye there, particularly because people were trying to come in to the building via that end of the road.
Absolutely. There's going to be a lot of questions about what happens next for some of the family members, and I suppose it's anybody's guess at the moment. Even we as members of the media haven't necessarily been given consolidated information about where they'll be stationed, and more importantly, how they're going to be helped to rebuild their lives.
I saw people late yesterday trying to get their names on the list to get shelter. A lot of NGOs came to the party as far as providing food is concerned. Also, there were a lot of children out here, so a lot of help is still needed for the victims and survivors of this fire. Hopefully, government will be able to accommodate them in the shelters that they have been provided. But a lot of them late yesterday when we were leaving here were saying that they don't know where they are going to sleep. For the families who have not been able to identify their loved ones yet, government, the Department of Health has issued out a statement to say they are called to go to the Deep Kloof mortuary where they'll be able to identify their loved ones.
Absolutely. Zikhona, Tshona, for now, thanks very much indeed. It's certainly a moving story that we'll keep watching for you here on Newzroom Afrika. Look, at some stage, the grief is going to make way for anger, and I imagine at that point, accountability will have to kick in. Already, there are contrasting messages around how long police actually took to respond to this particular incident, whether or not some of the security personnel who are meant to be stationed here did their best to ensure that, at the very least, there isn't the escalation of the tragedy as we've seen it, and whether or not, in fact, some of those who were involved or who were given the responsibility of extinguishing the fire were on hand when they were initially called. We did, however, get an opportunity to speak to at least one security guard who was stationed here. He says he was traumatized by what happened. Take a listen.
We sprang into action when we saw what was happening. People were wailing, people were crying for help, people were falling from the top of the building. And then we went straight to the building. We told people to break the windows. They must jump straight to us. We were receiving them, putting them down. Some couldn't come to us straight. They were falling down direct to the hard ground. I think there are some fatalities from that falling.
Michelle, the fire here has completely been doused out, but the story is nowhere near over. At some stage, I imagine, we're going to have to also tackle the many other issues that it's unraveled about just how dysfunctional government has become and how that ultimately has cost lives.
Absolutely, Ayanda, and we've already started having those important conversations, right? The danger of a xenophobic response to what's unfolded there in the inner city, and how we've gotten here, how the wealthiest city on the African continent is facing these incredible issues of underdevelopment. In fact, our guest at 6:45 is Dr. Richard Pithouse, so stay tuned for that interview as well. Ayanda, for now, thanks very much indeed.